Howdy, friends. Welcome back. You might be asking, Helen, why are you wearing this stupid hat? And that is because I felt like I was too low energy in my previous videos. And so now I'm in costume for today's topic, which is deputy speeches. So, briefly, this is part of a recorded lecture series for UChicago debaters who are trying to learn the basics of BP. This is the third video in the series on deputy speeches, and essentially the videos will walk through each part of the debate one by one. So, feel free to watch the previous videos or don't. I'm not going to tell you what to do. Okay, great. Today we're going to be discussing deputy speeches. Unlike last lecture where I was talking about a speech where I don't usually give, I actually do give deputy speeches and I've learned a decent bit about them over the years. And I think deputy speeches are really weird because you'll ask like 10 different people what makes a good deputy speech. And I feel like most people can't give a great answer besides vibes or like whatever needs to be done or it's flexible and you'll figure it out. And to me, that's like not helpful whatsoever, especially if you're beginning in the activity and you don't have a great sense of intuition about what makes a good deputy or what makes a bad deputy. And so my solution to this was both a lot of trial and error, emphasis on the error part, and also what I found very helpful was watching a lot of videos or debaters who gave deputies that just seemed to work and seemed to be good, and trying to ask myself what the commonality was between all of these speeches, even if there was different structure, different style, and different choices. Because I think even if the form of a deputy speech might change, obviously from round to round, my opinion is that the function and the objectives of the speech are pretty consistent throughout. And so that's what I'll try to give a broad overview of today is what these types of speeches should be trying to accomplish. And at the end of a deputy, what kind of questions you should be answering. So, what is the purpose of a deputy? It is a pretty weird speech because in BP, you only have two speeches per team, which means that you start by laying out the case in the first speech. It's fine, pretty straightforward. And then in the second speech, you basically have to do everything else, and that's it, right? That's big. That's essentially all you have time for in a round. And so what is the meaning of life? Like, what is a good deputy speech? And what makes an argument complete beyond just laying out the basic premises? So, to answer this question, I think it's helpful to think about what a speech could be lacking and what those missing pieces could be. And then thinking about the deputy as a sort of Bob the Builder type of character that has to patch up all of those sort of missing pieces. So the way that I like to think of it is yes, a deputy does everything. If you guys have ever had those like fruit roll-ups, very addicting, where it's like a really long thing and then you like roll it up and like unroll it. I like to think of a deputy as everything rolled into one. So in essence, it is not the kind of speech that is purely focused on rebuttal or purely focused on frontlining or weighing or wrapping the speech up. In essence, it's kind of like your job is to create the sense of finality, right? To roll everything into a point where you feel as though your case and everything you wanted to accomplish as a team has been sufficiently concluded. So, what are the biggest reasons as an OG or an OO team you might lose? I'm going to try to outline four of them. Firstly, let's hypothetically say that you're OG, right? The first reason you might lose as OG is just an internal reason that has nothing to do with any other team. And that's your arguments suck. Like, if you're missing burdens, if your case is constructed really shoddily, if you're, really off clash, then you'll probably lose even if no one else says anything. Like, let's say there's zero teams, you might just get a fourth, and the other, one to three might literally just be null. So that's the first reason. Second reason is maybe it's OO's fault, right? Maybe the OO team is just super strong, super based, and they just beat you in a fair one-to-one joust. In a typical like two team format, then you can imagine if the other team is better than you just automatically lose to them. Third reason, and perhaps more interestingly, is something that seems a little bit more out of your control, which is that a closing team comes in and just makes you irrelevant, they make you seem unimportant, or maybe they outweigh you. So maybe they're like, opening half is not talking about the right kinds of things. Or let me come up with a new argument that basically blows the judge out of the water. Or maybe even they say the same thing as you, but they just say it a little bit better. And in which case, I think it's kind of like the judge has amnesia and the opening half sort of just falls out of the debate. And as an opening team, right, you're left wondering like, did the judge just forget everything I said because it seems like they're not crediting anything at all. At least for me, these are sort of the three big reasons why I find myself losing rounds. So, as deputy, basically your job is hedging against all three of these things. How do you do that? Well, let's start one by one. Firstly, if your arguments suck, then obviously I think what you need to do as a deputy is to fix the logical gaps in the case, both that you've identified while your partner is speaking by just thinking critically and sort of acting as the bad cop in that situation, or by addressing any direct rebuttals or POIs that implicitly point out where the case is flawed, right? So if the, LO comes up and makes a clown show out of your case and points out a few pretty obvious places where it's weak, you kind of know where to look. Same with POIs, right? Like, yes, your first speaker is going to answer the POI in a few sentences, but they're going to do so with a relatively fast turnaround time. They're probably not going to do so sufficiently, and you know that that one sentence POI is going to turn into you getting paragraphed far later down in the round. And so you're going to want to address the crux of what the point was getting at in your rebuttal as well. So that's how to ensure, you are not your own worst enemy. Secondly, you obviously want to directly refute the opposing team and outweigh their arguments, because in that way, at least you can guarantee that you beat the other team that you're going against. And that's sort of the part of the deputy that I think gets highlighted the most, where it's like, oh, you're directly refuting the other side and you're going through each of their arguments one by one. And I think lastly, and maybe, perhaps most undertouched, is the fact that you need to make sure that you stay relevant in the round. And this comes out in a lot of different ways because you don't really know what the back half is going to say. So it's not like you really want to be like, hypothetically, if they say this, then these are my responses. If they say that, these are my responses. Because the closing team can just re-optimize and choose the thing that you didn't touch on, or just quickly respond to the preemptions that you made. So I think what is most important is for you to frame out the opposing closing half or any closing team, right? By making sure that your arguments last the longest in the judge's mind. And then you also might want to do things like burn turf or preempt extensions. In my personal opinion, I think these are a little bit less effective. Like, you're not realistically going to run everything a closing team is going to run, but you might want to find yourself, making the other kinds of intuitive arguments that your first speaker didn't make as a way to make sure that at least the easy stuff and the obvious stuff does not get taken by a closing team. So, what is the purpose of each of these things? In my opinion, the most important thing is making sure your arguments don't suck, because that avoids the hard fourth. By refuting the other team on the top half, you can at least guarantee yourself a third, which is why I think, in general, as an opening team, you should really not find yourself hard fourthing most of the time. And then lastly, if you can do this last part, that's really how you ensure yourself a one or a two. And so, in order of priority, obviously you want to avoid fourthing, then securing a three, and then ensuring a one or a two. Because I think, like, obviously it is better to play it safe than to imagine that you're, I don't know, the smartest person in the room. So, in other words, you might have heard of the four F's of a deputy speech. I forget which video it was, but I'll link it down below. I think each of these potential ways to lose sort of is what informs what people call the four F's or the four duties of a deputy speech, right? By patching up your argument, you're fixing things. By attacking the other top half team, you're fighting. And then lastly, you're framing and fielding. So I think the four F's of a deputy speech sort of make up the pie chart of what the platonic ideal of a speech should be. It should be about a third extension or new material, a third rebuttal, and maybe a third rebuilding. But in my eyes, I think it's maybe less helpful to think of it as a pie chart where one third of your speech is like actually separated into each of these three things, but more of what your obligations as a speaker are towards addressing those three duties. And you can sort of combine and wrap them into one. And so, how do you do each of these things? I'll get more into this later, but when you're fixing things, obviously what you want to prioritize are things that are hard to take down, right? You want to use structural reasons, aka reasons that seem to fall naturally from the motion or naturally from certain facts of the world, and you want to appeal to common sense. So, yes, it might seem like my partner is overclaiming their impacts, or maybe they missed, this important piece of characterization about what parents or governments or children look like. But obviously, this is what we meant, and this is the natural way that this is likely to play out. Then, by framing, essentially what you're just trying to do is explaining why your side is more important. Fighting is attacking the core of the other side's case, and then fielding, you can kind of imagine as like a sort of goalkeeper, is trying to preempt extensions by saying things like, if clothing says X, then Y. So, regardless of what way you use to memorize sort of your duties, which I think are quite intuitive, I think the essence is less of like, oh, do I remember fix, frame, fight, field every time that I'm debating? And more of, am I thinking about every way we could possibly lose and making sure that none of those things happen? I think that's maybe a more helpful way to think about it. But if you find the 4Fs framework more helpful, if you're in a sort of consulting NPC mindset where like frameworks are something really easy for you to memorize, then by all means, I think you should write this down, put it on a sticky note, and try to remind yourself implicitly to be running through this checklist in your head. What is this? Well, essentially, I kind of just made this for a different presentation and I thought it would be funny. But as a deputy, what you want to avoid doing is this sort of endless pinballing and back and forth with the other team. Because, like, this might work if you get the last word, but on a top half team, you're never going to get the last word. As a DPM, there's a DLO behind you, and as a DLO, there's still four other guys behind you. And so if you go in this like first sort of example of gov, op, then basically what's going to end up happening is you give an argument, they say you're wrong, you say they're wrong, they say, nah, here's this thing you forgot to talk about, and then you cry, right? And so that's why, as a deputy, it is way more effective to approach the round as a time where you take the other side at their best and you're not just trying to, shoot down each and everything they say, right? So saying things like, I already know what the other team is going to say, and I'm going to take their responses into consideration and still explain why we win. Both just makes you seem a lot more intelligent, right? It doesn't seem like you're doing this endless back and forth flip-flopping. And it also, I think, speeds up and accelerates the debate, which is the kind of skill I think takes a little bit of practice and requires round vision, but makes things a lot more efficient. Because instead of going A, B, A, B, A, B, right? You're able to say, I know that the other team is going to say B. And in light of that, I am going to do responses and weighing and framing that takes that into account and explain why we still win the round. And I think the most effective deputies operate in this light rather than the kind of deputy that just, systematically takes every single person's argument down. Because I think that the latter kind of deputy, right, the really efficient one that's going line by line, you have to know a lot about the world. You have to be incredibly efficient with your time. You probably have to think really quickly. You have to talk relatively quickly. And I just think, at least for someone like me, that is quite a difficult skill to train rather than just slowing down and trying to be more strategic rather than extremely methodical. So you're probably asking now, what does a deputy look like? Because to me, that's like the question, right? Like, I don't really like to have these like vagus things that you should do. I really just want to know, like, can you tell me what I'm supposed to do? And then I can try to execute and perfect that. And so, for our team trainings, at least for novice to intermediate debaters, I try to have a structure that I think is tried and tested that works relatively well that I think people should follow. And I can say with like a reasonable level of confidence that if you structure your deputies in this kind of format, you at least won't embarrass yourself and you won't humiliate yourself. And you'll tend to touch on most of the types of things that are required for a good deputy. And I would say that even now, like mentally, this is how I structure my deputy speeches with some adjustments based on what the round looks like. And so I made a really bad drawing with my stylus to try to show what that looks like. And I genuinely would like write down the structure with the time allocations and put it directly in front of my matter file or directly on my computer and like look at my timer while I was talking to remind myself to go through each and every one of these things. Okay. So what is this like heinous drawing right here? You might be thinking. So, bear with me. The first part of the speech should be about a 45-second introduction and roadmap to what you're saying. I think this is fairly standard for most BP speeches. Um, in the similar way that a PM or an LO might start out with a snazzy little introduction, and then you might say, I'm about to say three things, one, two, three. This part, I think, is a little bit less discussed, which is after you have a very broad overview of what your speech is likely to be, you're going to want to prove your path to victory for about 2 minutes. And this is not something that I think a lot of people discuss, which is that in the first 2 minutes of your deputy speech, in my opinion, you don't need to be introducing that much rebuttal and that much new substantive material. Your main priority should be taking what your first speaker has already said and making sure that that, independently of anything else that happens in the round, is winning material. Next, this is maybe the more traditional part of the deputy speeches, which is, the traditional turns or flips or rebuttal structure, where I think that the most effective way to do a deputy is not thinking about how you can firstly rebuttal and then also burn material that your back half might run, but it's generating offensive material that both responds to the other team, but also acts as an independent argument that the judge could potentially vote on. Because realistically, the way that a debate works isn't that like you say something and the other side says something that's completely independent. Like most of the time, your responses to something that another team might say is just going to be another argument for your side as well. That is just slightly more interactive. So I think if you give three solid pieces of rebuttal, that rebuttal will also just be extensions that the judges are able to vote on. And then the last 30 seconds, I think, should be sort of an inverse funnel where you are widening the debate back up and summarizing the stakes of the debate to ensure that that articulation and narrative stays in your judge's mind. And as I've said before, I think a great analogy for this is actually the typical literary essay that you might see in English class and that you learn in middle school and you learn in high school, where you start with the hook. Your introduction, per se, should be a reverse funnel paragraph where you start wide and you narrow down very quickly to the central core of the debate, right? You give three body paragraphs or pieces of content that are independent and should stand alone from each other. And then finally, you give a conclusion that widens things back up and creates their implication for the wider world. I'll now proceed to discuss each of these points piece by piece because I think that genuinely, each one of them are crucial and critical to sort of constructing and designing victory in a very clear way. So here are the kind of like key terms that you might hear that signal each of these pieces. The introduction is going to be, in this speech, I'm going to do blank, right? The path to victory, you'll always hear people say things like, here's how we win outright, or here's why you should vote for us, even if everything the other side is true. For the key rebuttal, if you structure them as independent voters, you'll find yourself saying, what is the end point of this? What am I trying to prove with this rebuttal that I am making, rather than just sort of going like this to your opponent? And then finally, to summarize the stakes, you'll definitely be saying things like, why do we provide the most important contribution of the round over any closing team? The over any closing team is sometimes implicit in these kinds of weighing statements, but I think it is perfectly fine and probably good to make it explicit as well. Okay, great. Let's start with the first 45 seconds, this little block right here as the intro and roadmap. In my opinion, I think a deputy introduction should be very similar to a PM and LO introduction in the sense that it shouldn't just be a throwaway statement, but it should be an analogy, a metaphor, a good roast to your opponents, imagery, anecdotes, facts, statistics that summarize the core crux of the argument that you are trying to go for and is a 30-second summary to why you should win that sticks in the judge's mind and makes some kind of poignant, impression onto them. And I think you can watch either my last video or Noam Dahan's video on PMLO speeches to get a good idea of what I mean by these kinds of introductions. I really don't think that you should just jump straight into your deputy and go line by line because that just makes it very hard for the judge to grasp what it is that you're trying to say. And I think, in particular, this kind of introduction should aim to capture the crucial clash in the debate and also how your opponent misses the clash. So, unlike PMLO introductions, which I think tend to be a little bit more flowery, something like, you know, the economic conditions of people on the ground imply that there is no way that we should deprive people of the means to exist, right? I don't think that is necessarily the intro you have to do at a deputy. Instead, you should have something relatively snippy like this, right? What Op wants to debate seems to be an articulation of the world where everyone gets all of the resources they need and governments have perfect incentives. But clearly, this debate is about the instances and the countries where perfect incentives and perfect information do not exist. And that is the most important metric we should weigh on in the round. Or it could be an analogy, right? Op wants to assume that there is a easy band-aid fix that comes in the form of policy for every issue that we have. Our argument is that band-aids do not exist in the real world, blah, 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 something like that, right? You can use an analogy, you can use a metaphor, but what that metaphor should be trying to do is summarizing the debate that has already happened rather than just being a re-articulation of the arguments that you already have made in the PM and LO speech. And then you can give your blueprint from your speech by saying that you're going to do three things, right? But I think the most important thing to do in this introduction is to synthesize what you think the debate should be about right now in this very moment. And sometimes that does mean prioritizing certain arguments that you made in the PM or the LO rather than trying to go for everything, right? So identifying what at this point seems like your strongest way to win and making that exceptionally clear. Next, and I want people to listen up, okay? If there is one thing that you listen to in this entire lecture, it is going to be what I am going to say next. Because I genuinely think that the next 2 minutes that I'm going to describe is going to be the most important and maybe like the only thing that you need to do successfully in deputy to actually win the debate. And everything else is like a good add-on. It's a good plus one. Uh, it's a good, expansion pack. But like this is the game, guys. Like this is genuinely the core of what I think a good deputy does that I do not think deputies do enough. And that is prove a path to victory for 2 minutes. And here's where I genuinely think that like the cross-pollination of different debate formats is pretty helpful. Because I was thinking about this, where I did a bit of, a decent bit of APTA, American Parley, before I did any kind of British Parley. And so my brain was very like attuned to that kind of debating. And I never thought about the fact that there are things to be learned from applying some of those APTA lessons to BP until I realized something, which is that in BP, a lot of debaters tend to treat the deputy, sorry, I just like lost all the thoughts in my mind for a second. They tend to treat the deputy as a rebuttal speech, aka a speech that is purely dedicated to taking down the other side. They don't remember that the deputy speech is the last speech of the round. And in world schools, right, you have three opportunities, I think, to give your case. So obviously the middle speech can just go line by line, right? They can just avoid doing the sort of wrap up and synthesis that the last speaker has to do. This also applies to every form of high school debate. This applies to every form of American parliamentary debate, right? But BP debate is not like that. And so sometimes because you're allowed to give new material in the deputy speech, you don't have to treat it like a whip. People don't think about having a section of your speech where you do not introduce new material and all you do is weigh and position. But I think that there should be a dedicated time in your deputy that is very explicitly conceding everything, assuming that the other side gets their exact best case, not introducing any new substantive material, and still trying to win. You can think of this as akin to the APTA PMR, where it's the last speech of the round, no one is allowed new arguments, or you can think of this as akin to a whip, right? Where a whip is the last speech on closing half, and they cannot introduce new material, And so it's not really clear to me why people don't think of deputies as a little bit of a whip in and of itself. What do I mean by this? Force yourself for 2 minutes of your speech to only win the round based on the material that the PM or the LO has already given. You can patch up some of the arguments, right? So if there's crucial rebuttal that the other side has given that basically makes it functionally impossible for you to win, fill those up. But then I think you should explicitly say, even if everything op says is true, because we prove this impact in the round, we should still win. And so I think realistically what this looks like is something like this. So you give your introduction and then you say, the reason why we cleanly win this debate outright is because we have proved that there is economic downturn or insert impact such that that independently outweighs op, even if it is true that we grant them the best case and they prove that A is true, they prove that B is true, and they prove that C is true. In response to this argument, op has given us a few pieces of rebuttal. Firstly, they say X, right? But clearly this falls because of Y. They then question, they say that we don't have a comparative, but this is not true because the comparative is blank. They say that we're missing this burden, but the burden is that. Then after you patch up all these holes, right? You give the characterization, you give the framing, you give the comparative, you give the burdens. Then you say, the bottom line is that we have already proven this thing is true. So even if closing tries to shift the debate, even if closing widens the margin by 5%, by 10%, as long as we are the team that proves that lives are devastated, that economic impacts are terrible, or that children are able to actualize themselves, or people are given the right to self-determination, then we ought to win this debate. That, in my opinion, is the most important part of the deputy speech, because if we go back to the F's framework, it basically accomplishes most of these duties. It fixes your case by patching up the holes. It fights not by giving direct rebuttal, but by giving the kind of weighing that explains why your metric is the most important metric in the round, and by explaining what your path to victory is, and by explaining the bottom line, you are implicitly fielding and framing against closing half without even burning any turf, without even having to preempt any of their extensions explicitly. I would practice this part of the debate or this part of the speech if you're a deputy, and genuinely trying to incorporate this as the first thing that you say in the round. Here's an example. So there are many kinds of motion types, particularly narrative motions or motions where most teams are going to be aiming at the same impacts, where basically there's going to be an impasse on the top half, where it's like there's an assertion, there's characterization, there's framing, and they're kind of just equal. Like they kind of sound the same, and it just feels like a deadlock. And closing is just going to say, there is a deadlock. Let us break the deadlock. And so this 2 minutes should try to break that. And here's a good example, right? There's this classic debate about parenting where it's like, as a parent, you should teach your kid to handle their emotions through stoicism or being rational, right? Being logical rather than emotionalism, which suggests that people should embrace their emotion. Emotions are natural and healthy, and people shouldn't suppress them. Both of them seem like valid parenting strategies. And in reality, like in the real world, the answer is probably something like there should be 50-50. And so there's not really a clean cut way to be like, you're completely wrong, you're lying, you don't understand the world. Gov is going to say, kids should learn to be rational because emotional outbursts are bad for their future. Kids tend to overreact, which is why there is an incentive to help them process their emotions. And parents are the only people who teach them how to be logical because, other kids or in school, there's not time to do these things. And Op will say the opposite, right? They're just going to be like, when a kid is really sad, it is very stupid to try to force them to be logical and suppress their emotions. If you do that, they're just going to bury their emotions and have sudden rage outbursts that end up being a lot worse. And if parents do this, their kids are going to resent them really badly. Let's say both of these things are relatively well proven. Like, how are you going to orchestrate your path to victory? How are you going to win this round? And I think this is where you have to start, thinking in this PMR style, which is like, you can't straw man the other side, right? On Gov, you shouldn't say, wow, Op just wants everyone to be wishy-washy. They want kids to start bawling and screaming and throwing temper tantrums and rewarding that. That's so stupid. An op shouldn't be like, Gov wants every kid to be like Aristotle. They think that parents should just turn their kid into little logic robots who go beep boop and ignore the fact that they have emotions. That's not gonna win you the round. I think like what is more realistic on Gov is just being like, look, we grant that op is correct, right? Kids are going to have emotions. They're not going to be able to be perfectly rational in times of crises. And emotions are healthy and they are good. But the point being is that emotionalism overwhelmingly teaches parents to have a relatively hands-off strategy. They teach parents that emotions are natural and that you should allow kids to feel whatever it is they feel in the moment. But the issue is, it's not whether or not kids feel sad or happy or angry in response to a specific situation. It's obviously the fact that people tend to not reflect on the situation past the initial emotional outbreak, right? Which is the reason why kids who are not taught how to be logical and rational after something dramatic happens tend to feel the similar emotions again and again. They tend to not know how to deal with failure. They tend to not know how to deal with it when someone says something mean and they feel angry. And so, stoicism, even if it is true that it might make, parents slightly less sympathetic to children, is the unique impact that we have to prioritize because otherwise kids are going to fall into similar cycles of emotionalism over time and they're not going to be able to learn and iterate from their mistakes. And this is really important because Stoicism also teaches parents how to handle emotions such that kids learn to be logical after them. So it's not like you're going to say, "Hey, your kid is crying. Let's tell them to shut up." It's going to be it's going to be teaching parents how to convert that crying into something productive, right? How to calm a kid down from that rage so that they can listen to the reasoning that a parent wants to say. Because otherwise on op, even if parents are great and have great incentives on both sides of the house, it's just going to be incredibly difficult for a parent to talk sense into a child when they are in that heightened state of emotion, right? And so, like, that kind of sort of charitable conversation, charitable framing is way, way, way more effective at orchestrating your victory than trying to strawman the other side. And then the weighing that you can give is just that, like, yes, closing might try to explain different contexts in which this happens. They might try to add additional mechanisms for why parents are likely to be rational or irrational. But the key crux is that we explain the way that this is likely to happen, and we explain why rationality is just a prerequisite to any kind of positive agency and change in the future. And because that is the core centerpiece of this debate, that is the reason why we should win. I think genuinely, if a team is able to be the first one to do that in this type of motion, their odds of like at least having a good chance of winning the debate is going to be incredibly high. So that's my little spiel on this little triangle. Next, let's talk about rebuttal, which I think there's tons of good videos about, and there's tons of good, analysis about what rebuttal is. And later I'll talk about the types of rebuttal. But at least organizationally, I think the point of rebuttal in a debate should not be going line by line because that's not how BP judges vote. I think judging a few debates, if you've debated for a while and you're kind of hitting a wall, is an incredibly helpful tool because you kind of realize that, like, judging, even if you try to be methodical, if you have literally 5 minutes to come to a decision before you talk with the panel, is going to be vibes based no matter what. And as a judge, even if I flow like in a quite technical way, I just cannot look at every response. And so, more important than giving a million responses is explaining what the takeaway and the function of your rebuttal is. And so, basically, what I think this looks like is taking, let's say, Gov makes two arguments. You're going to just try to make the offensive version of those two arguments. You're going to say, Gov claims this, and our claim is that that is not true. You give like 3 pieces, 4 pieces of good rebuttal, and then you explain at the conclusion of this rebuttal, the takeaway or the bottom line of this rebuttal is that we prove that not only what they say is sufficiently mitigated to not be true, that there's also offensive reason to believe that this is a place where you can vote for our side of the house because our weighing is more compelling, our framing is more convincing, we are more preemptive, we come logically prior, which is the reason why you should default to our side. I think like a lot of people can give decent responses, but it is that sort of reflection and synthesis of the response itself that is often lacking. That is what is required for judges to break deadlock between decent rebuttal and decent case constructive. And that's also very helpful as a deputy because, like, realistically, the other side, the other deputy does not have time to respond to every response they give to the case. And so, by being the person that gives the weighing of your responses versus their case, right? Weighing that is integrated and weighing that is responsive, you have a good advantage over a team that can only give weighing that is not comparative explicitly. And so here's like an example of what you can say after a rebuttal. You might say something like this, and I think I plagiarized this from somewhere. The conclusion of this rebuttal is simple. The benefit Gov strives for in terms of economies of scale is either factually uncertain or heavily marginal. So this is explaining what your rebuttal just did, which is by significantly mitigating and questioning the premise. Moreover, there are unique economic inefficiencies that arise when financial institutions exist at some scale. So, if the first thing is pure mitigation, the second thing is now explaining why your responses are not only mitigation, but they're also offensive. So, they're a flip, right? Not only is the what, Gov says not true, it might actually be the opposite, aka it creates economic inefficiencies. And the final function of the rebuttal, right, is the explicit weighing. And weighing, I don't mean impact is bigger, impact influences more people, it helps the most vulnerable population. No, it is weighing between why your reasons are more convincing than their reasons if they are competing with each other. So, saying something like, therefore, when weighing this debate, you should prioritize our materials on recession, given how non comparative and insignificant this Gov argument is, right? If the judge had all of Gov and they had all of Op and they're just on a scale, right? And you're just trying to weigh between the material and it's really unclear which way the scale tips, what you are doing is just giving a reason why the scale ought to tip in your favor. And if you're the only team that provides that, then as a judge with very little time, it is easy to default to the weighing that has already been given that rather than trying to put together the puzzle pieces in your head. Great. The last thing that you should be trying to do, this sort of reverse funnel paragraph, yes, reverse funnel, is summarizing the stakes of the debate. And this, like, honestly, I'm not great at time allocation, so I miss it a lot of the time, but it's kind of like a cherry on top. And it does sort of a similar thing to this first triangle, but at the end of the debate, because I think it is important to start and end with a bang. And so it's essentially just a few lines that sandbags the closing team, right? You just want to make sure that they can avoid massively changing what the debate is about by just explaining what the fundamental clash is. So basically, just saying, like, we explained why the most important thing in the debate is this, and that's the fundamental clash. Do not let our closing team knife us or shift what the debate is about. Summarize your narrative, right? Just endorse again that voter that you decided was the most important. And thirdly, just weigh the most strategic case line. And I think the easiest way to weigh this is to provide metrics, right? Being like the team that proves why they save the most lives, why they help people get a job is the most important. And you tangibilize the impacts to the most human level, right? So you basically just try to intuition pump as much as possible at the end of the debate by being like, we save people from falling back into cycles of poverty. We provide at least the very basic means of subsistence. We prevent people from literally being evicted from their homes and thrown out onto the streets. And these are the kinds of things that are much more important than what happens, 10, 20, 30, 40 years into the future, because it's the core tenets for basic agency, right? Like, I think those are the kinds of terminalizing to the most human impacts. And the more specific and visceral and emotional you can get, I think the better. So that's sort of what I think the sort of end of the debate should be. It is closing the debate in a way that sufficiently makes sure that you are the team that lasts the longest in the judge's mind and that they are not actually able to forget the contributions that you've made because it is clear what exactly it is that you are trying to go for. Great. So that's my TLDR on the organization of a good deputy speech. And hopefully, I think that this is like relatively novel. Like, I haven't seen that many people sort of have the same spiel, but I will say that, like, you can obviously change these pieces around, you can adapt them, and I don't think that this is like a you must actually speak in the same time, in the same way every single time you do a deputy. But I do think that if you're starting out, this is like a good sort of framework to follow. Next, let's talk about rebuttal because that rebuttal is a big core part of deputy speeches, and I think it's an important skill for people to learn. Um, Essentially, rebuttal is trying to turn something bigger into something smaller and explaining why a thing that someone says is true is not true. And I think like sort of a deputy speech, there's many different ways you can go about it. And I would say that like there's no correct or objectively like optimal way to do rebuttal. It depends on the argument, it depends on the round. I think diversifying, portfolio theory style, diversifying your assets is incredibly helpful because you sort of get to hedge what rebuttal is effective and ineffective by giving different types and different forms. Whereas I think a lot of people tend to be stuck in one type of rebuttal. And that's not always the same type for each kind of person. But a lot of the times, people just like to do flips. They just like to do mitigation. They just like to symmetricize. And they don't think about all the other kinds of tools in their toolbox that are available. What are the types of rebuttal? People have tons of different words, tons of different ways to sort of think about them. But I think like thinking about an argument as like a circle ball and then thinking about rebuttals as ways to negate the existence of that ball is sort of like a helpful way to just understand the different ways that you might take someone out. Firstly, you can question the premise or truth, aka you have this ball and you say the ball it's not real. It doesn't exist. Like Gov says, fact claim, and I just do not think that is true. Obviously, if you can execute this properly, it is quite effective because it completely takes out the argument. But the issue is, in most debates, it's a debate because it's subjective and it's very hard to take something completely off the table. Next thing you can do is flip an argument. So let's say someone says the ball is blue. You say, yes, the ball exists, but the ball is red. So either by saying that you have different ways to get to the same impact, aka if the impact is economic devastation, you say true, but actually we cause economic devastation, or you just take the impact that the team is going for and say that the impact itself is bad. AKA, they might say, the impact is more people are born, which is good because it helps economic growth. And you might just say, no, that's bad because more people eat animals and cause global warming, right? So that's a flip of the impact. You're essentially just turning an argument 180 degrees. Next, mitigation. Mitigation is turning a big ball from, wait, no, turning a ball from a big ball to a smaller ball. This is probably the easiest kind of rebuttal, but the least effective in the sense that, like, it's not that hard to be like, look, the other team is overclaiming their impacts. Let me give some reasons why. They say the economy is going to crash 50%. It's actually going to be 25%. But obviously, the issue is like, if you're mitigating, the ball still exists. And so if you think of arguments as a little scale, if you don't move the ball from one side of the scale to another side of the scale and you merely shrink it, a lot of it is just going to depend on the comparative size of the weight on the other side. Finally, then you might identify a structural weakness in the sense that the argument might be true if it were sufficiently well proven, but there is some reason that it isn't. It's missing a burden, right? It's not comparative, aka it just exists on both sides of the scale. There's no tipping point. It's not unique. There's some kind of tension. And that is actually quite effective because what it does is basically makes a ball or a weight contingent. So it's kind of just like forcing the judge to cast some kind of doubt and critically evaluate whether or not an argument actually gets to be put on the scale at all. That ball might exist, the ball might be true, but if you sort of crack that ball in half, it no longer exists in full form, and as such, should not be evaluated in the round itself. So these are the sort of four horsemen of a BP rebuttal, and I would divide them into two sort of categories. These two forms of rebuttal are devastating if used correctly, but basically useless if they don't work because they're binary. An argument is either true or false, and an argument is either flipped or they're not flipped, right? And so while a lot of proponents of flipping arguments might say this is good because it creates offensive content, you don't want to make sure you do want to make sure that flips are not the only thing that you're running, precisely because it's very binary in nature. And what you say is a flip is low-key probably not a flip, especially if you're trying to flip 3 minutes worth of material in a 30-second rebuttal. So maybe at best you just say you're flipping something, but in reality, what you're doing is just mitigating. So you do want to be careful when you're using these kinds of rebuttal. If you want to like hedge more, then these next two things, in my opinion, are scalar, right? Because if you're mitigating something or you're identifying a weakness, yes, you're not taking out that ball in its entirety, you're only shrinking its size, but you are casting enough doubt that as long as you have substantive content, your rebuttal is probably going to be somewhat effective, even if not 100% effective. And so you know that it at least does something for the round that makes it easier for you to win. Which is why, in my eyes, I think that you should combine both binary and scalar forms of rebuttal and debate in order for you to both make it easier for yourself to win and harder for the opponent to win. So let's go through each of these one by one. First, questioning the premise. When should you do this? In my opinion, unless you want to sound quite, pretentious and um like delusional, for lack of a better word, you typically don't want to claim that a team's argument is entirely false unless you're quite certain that it's a fact claim or an assertion that is probably not true. And I think the litmus test for whether or not true stands is if you can gut check or intuition pump your responses with either simple fact claims or examples or anecdotes that are relatively well known. And the reason for this is, unless you can sort of intuition pump something with a fact that most people know, it is pretty hard to ascertain whether premise A or premise B is true in a vacuum as a judge, right? Like if one team says like, "Oh, my my height is 5'9" and someone else says my height is 5'10, unless I have a measuring stick live, it's not super easy to determine whether that is true or false. But comparatively, like, gut checking something like being like, look, like 5'10" is not average height for a woman, need I say more, is like pretty intuitive enough such that you can probably counter the claim that 5'10" is average height without needing to say a lot more and without being worried that there might be some gray area. So here's some examples concretely that I think would be effective simply by just saying, okay, like this premise is clearly not true. One could just be a broad overgeneralization. Governments generally have good incentives because they are accountable to their voters. Well, like, gut check this, right? Like, clearly, this is not true empirically, both because there's tons of political capture, there's lobbying, not basically no government is perfectly democratic. There's, selectorate theory, which implies that certain political groups might capture the government even if they are in a minority. There's corruption and collusion, etc. Pretty obvious. Next could just be a definitional or technical reason why something is not true. So, for instance, in a debate about job security legislation, which is specifically about whether or not you can fire workers, a team might say job security legislation, which prevents people from being fired on a whim, helps their workers retain their jobs in times of economic crisis because they don't get laid off. Maybe sounds convincing, but then you might think about it and you could say, well, look, you like firing is different from being laid off intuitively. Companies lay people off in times of economic crisis or when their company is not performing well. And when you get laid off, you typically have layoff packages that pay you for like 6 months of your salary, etc. But like whether or not this happens is entirely separate from the question of people being fired, which is due to performance-based reasons. So you're not firing people in times of economic crisis anyways. So that claim is just intuitively not true and irrelevant to the debate. Pretty easy gut check. Third might be just definitional or fact claims, right? Class action lawsuits are good because they help put CEOs that are evil in jail when a lot of people come together and sue. You might say, well, civil cases do not result in jail time, right? Like civil cases, you can collect money, but you cannot throw someone into jail. So that's a really silly argument. And finally, you might just have things that are not necessarily definitionally or technically true, but like empirically and anecdotally just are not the case because of some widely accepted economic or political theory. So, for instance, a lot of teams might just make the assertion that rent-controlled apartments tend to increase housing supply because like people get to stay where they're living and they then want all these apartments. And you might just be like, guys, like when apartments are rent controlled, you see in New York City, overwhelmingly, they're being left empty because it's not worth it for a landlord to rent it out. Or they're just demolished and like people have no incentive to build more housing if they know that it's going to be rent controlled. This is obviously a very silly argument. If you open the news, you would probably realize this is not true. Any economic theory says that artificially inhibiting the price of something being rent or sold likely leads to dead weight loss, right? Like I think that is sort of something fine to say. So that's questioning the premise. Pretty simple. Next is flipping. And I think this is something that has gotten relatively more popular in debate. I think flipping works very well in like technical-ish formats that prioritize truth over tech or are like tabula rasa, where it's like the last thing that someone says stands. Because that really privileges flips because it basically means that like if you counter assert something and say that the opposite is true, if a team doesn't question that, then essentially the judge has to assume that like either what you said is true or that it's just like inadjudicable. I don't think that is the case in BP because I don't think that judges operate with the mindset of if someone says something is a flip and they give a few reasons for why it is a flip, that it actually flips an argument, right? They tend to look at things with a little bit more skepticism. So I think the most important thing you can do in flipping is that sort of implicit weighing of responses that I talked about earlier, which is to say that you should explain why your flip is likely to be more true and something that the judge should actually sort of default to if they're adjudicating between two things. So, example, in the motion, this House opposes job security legislation. Gov makes the argument. If it is more expensive to fire people, this decreases innovation and productivity for most firms. I.e., you want to be able to fire unproductive workers because otherwise they're going to bring the company down, right? Like they're going to just cause you to bleed money because you just have this lazy guy right here that you can't kick out. How would you flip this as op? You probably want to have a few reasons, compelling reasons, to believe that it is actually not true that job security legislation decreases productivity. In fact, it increases. Here are some ideas of how you might do this. One, job security legislation leads to more careful hiring practice. That is, if it's true that it sucks to fire someone and it's expensive to fire someone, then obviously, employers will just do a better job of vetting people from the get-go. If I know I can't fire Sally, even if she doesn't do her Excel spreadsheets, then I'm going to do a more careful interview process to make sure I don't hire people like Sally. And that's actually better for productivity because it decreases the costs of you having to re-recruit and retrain someone after you fire Sally. So if you think about it, what Gov is saying is you have someone like Sally, you fire her, and then you hire someone like Bill, who is more productive than Sally. Our argument is if firing is so expensive, then you're going to do a better job of making sure you just hire someone like Bill from the get-go. Yes, that might be slightly more expensive than hiring someone like Sally, but you don't have to do the process twice, right? You don't have to fire Sally, then hire and retrain Bill, which leads to tons of lag time, tons of money lost, and tons of sort of like transitory costs and shocks that just make things way more unproductive because now all of Sally's coworkers have to adjust to Bill joining the team. And the reason why this is true is like firms are future discounting. So it's like you might be asking, oh, why didn't they hire Bill from the get-go? Firms do not have perfect information. So if they think that they can fire Sally at a whim, a lot of the times they will just hire her because they're like, oh, worst case, we can fire her. They don't internalize the cost of having a bad new hire until it is time to fire that person, right? And so that's the reason why it actually leads to more unproductivity. That's one potential response. And that's sort of an example of like bootleg debate math that I think I talked about in previous lectures. Second, maybe more intuitively, you get increased worker productivity. Why? Well, if workers perceive that they're going to stay at the company in the long run because they're not likely to get fired for no reason, and that the company's treating them relatively well, they have a incentive to upskill, right? To train themselves to be more productive workers. They feel less anxiety. They are more productive when they go to work. This is actually incredibly important because one of the biggest market externalities in the job market is that workers do not have an incentive to upskill because they could improve their skills to help the company, but like a lot of the times they don't internalize these benefits as something that is good for them. However, if you make them care about the company, like the company, have a long-term career on there, that actually increases the average productivity of like most good workers. Finally, there's less turnover. So if workers are not constantly making sure they need a backup option in case they get fired, i.e., you can look at like some, financial firms that are known to have high turnover rates where people are like applying to business school and applying to other firms at the same time, then there's actually less turnover because people don't organically leave if they're fearing getting fired or if they have a better option. All reasons to flip this argument. But what should we prioritize, right? Like, how do we weigh against these claims? That's where it becomes most important. What's the weighing? The weighing is yes, we will actually just be very charitable and we will agree that firing becomes more expensive. And you probably do lose some money and efficiency from having to pay out good packages when you fire someone. However, proportionally, this is not the biggest proportion of where productivity comes from. Why? One, there are more good workers in a company than bad workers. This is just empirically true, right? So if there are 9 bills and one Sally, we would rather those 9 bills increase their productivity by 50%, even if it comes at the expense of not being able to fire Sally, who is not super productive. Because you benefit a lot more too from uplifting total productivity, even if there are a few bad eggs. And third, in terms of cost, it is much more costly to source new inflow than compensating outflow. It is more expensive to pay HR, to pay onboarding, to pay managers, to constantly rehire people than it is to simply compensate someone better for being fired. Those are the kinds of weighing that you can use to be charitable and still try to win the debate. One more example, because I think this is sort of good practice. You guys can practice. This has with nationalized social media companies. Common gov argument. Nationalization decreases coercive practices of social media firms like bad advertising, misinformation, hate speech by centralization, which leads to a better user experience. How would you then flip this to prove that no, in fact, nationalization actually leads to more coercive practices and a worse user experience? And then how would you weigh those responses against this initial claim? Great. I think like you don't need that many responses, right? Maybe two things. Firstly, without nationalization, people vote with their wallets. So if one company is bad, you can use a different app that you think is relatively better. And obviously, you would have to prove that there's some level of good competition in the social media industry. And two, governments, by nationalizing a company, are just acting as a small firm, right? Like it's going to be run by a certain sector or department of the government that is just going to be like an SOE, like a state-owned enterprise, right? A single monopolistic firm. We can be charitable and accept that like both governments and private companies have good and bad incentives, right? It's not like, the government is perfect or the government is imperfect or evil. But the whole point is that if the government is regulating private companies, you have two layers of checkbacks and you have an additional checkback because there's multiple firms that all can be watchdogs against each other. And so there's optionality if one platform tends to have a lot of hate speech and have a lot of misinformation. Comparatively, if the incentives of private and public firms are like relatively similar, if there is literally only one public firm, the chance that that becomes corrupt or, has misinformation or just cannot deal with hate speech in a great way is just a lot larger. So, a corrupt government, a government that, has a leader that wants to spread misinformation, just is going to be a lot worse than one private company that wants to do that, right? What's the weighing then? Be charitable. Yes, we agree that what Gov says might be true, and we're not claiming perfection here. However, two weighing. One, private markets have greater trajectory for improvement. So if both things start out bad, there's a greater potential for improvement, even if private markets right now or social media companies are not great, right? You can regulate them. You can have more competition. More entrants will arise when there's demand. Two, competitive incentives to race to the top are just way higher if you have 10 little firms and one big firm, even if all else equals, these firms have equally bad incentives. Again, bootleg debate math, right? These are the ways that I think you could actually sort of effectively flip an argument rather than just sort of counter asserting that the opposite is true.
Don't forget to take out your trash cans.
Thanks, Alexa. Next form of rebuttal is mitigation. Mitigation, I don't, think is too complicated, but basically, you want to prove that something is overclaimed, not plausible, symmetric, doesn't have a tipping point. Imagine yourself as a little miner in Minecraft trying to mine away at their argument and chip away like in the most effective way possible, block by block, right? And so like I would say words like, to be fair, op might prove blank to some degree, but a more realistic conception of the case is why. And our case should weigh over that why because of something or other. The point is, you're not trying to, decimate their argument. You're just trying to weigh um your more robust argument that you presumably rebuilt against their well mitigated argument. Some examples are first, claim children need to learn logic and rationality to control emotions. How would you mitigate this? You might mitigate this just by saying, they don't really actually need to do that. Like, realistically, the real world will hit them like a brick, and they're just going to be logical either way. And low key, in actuality, like, you don't really need to learn that much logic because right after something bad happens, most people just tend to start thinking of solutions. You might also symmetricize this by being like, yeah, they need to learn, but they learn on both sides of the house because there's tons of people in their lives, teachers, coworkers, bosses, that will just teach them this anyway. Next claim, without job security legislation, companies will go ham firing people left and right. Mitigation is being like, yes, they might fire some people, but we're just really going to question exactly how many people they're going to fire because companies obviously don't want to fire their workers because that's really expensive and costly and it looks really bad for company morale. Um, like even without legislation, there's tons of reasons to believe that competitive incentives means that companies like will not want to fire the most amount of people possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then you might just say like the bottom line is yes, some people might get fired. We prove that the ones who get fired are the worst of the worst, the worst bad apples, and it's not really that big of a deal. So you should prioritize our more important argument. That's sort of what mitigation is trying to do. It's basically like being like, yo, they're making a mountain out of a molehill. Yes, we are so charitable and we recognize that that molehill exists, but it's clearly not that important, right? And I think trying to sound reasonable and really sort of ethos pumping in that sense um, is a good strategy in general for mitigation. Finally, then, I think a very underrated form of rebuttal is just pointing out structural weaknesses. And I think this is just like underrated because people don't think about structural reasons for why an argument aren't true when they're sort of just intuitively writing down responses very quickly because your natural inclination is just being like, fact, why is this fact untrue? Rather than seeing how the whole collection of facts that makes up an argument is perhaps not doing what a team thinks they're doing. And this is very good rebuttal because it's highly efficient, especially at the DLO. Because when you point out a team just doesn't have a burden or it's missing a comparative later in sort of the top half, it's so hard for them to recover, both technically, like give enough material to do so, but also perceptually, because it's like it's the expectation that that has already been accomplished from the get-go. And so a judge has an incentive to discredit a team they feel as though has not accomplished the thing that they are supposed to. And when I'm judging, it's not like I'm not super careful about checking off whether a team has met every single one of their structural obligations either, right? I'm also focused on taking down the words of their argument and thinking about what people are just saying on the flow. So any team that sort of acts as a breath of fresh air and forces the judge to think about whether or not there actually is something missing, which then gets talked about during, the panel discussion and then gets factored into the OA has a huge advantage, with the caveat being that the structural weakness that they point out is actually missing. Because I think a lot of the times teams will just be like, they don't have this, they don't have that. So I think when you're pointing out a structural weakness, you want to not only just point out that it doesn't exist, but you want to explain why you believe that to be true and what that means for the round. So, like, this team is missing a comparative because they don't actually prove that it is impossible for these arguments to apply on. Wait, no, sorry. This team is missing a comparative because they don't explain what's likely to happen in the absence of this motion, which means that yes, maybe they prove some harms or maybe they prove some benefits, but they just never prove that, A, B, or C plausible things that could happen are not going to be more harmful or more beneficial, right? And so giving what A, B, and C is and explaining what that does for the round is sort of a good structural response. And yeah, like this is obviously devastating because to give a personal example, I went to like I was dancing in high heels and my heels completely broke. Like somehow the glue was just like really faulty. And so I like had to scotch tape the shoes to my feet for like 3 hours because I wasn't going home. And my feet got so blistered. They were very much in pain. And I was like, bro, I cannot do this anymore, no matter how fun this night is. And so, like, I guess the point is if you can annihilate the foundation that an argument stands on, you make it very difficult for that person to have a good time and to dance their heart out. That's all I'm saying. Great. Now that we've gone through the types of rebuttal, the last thing that I guess people sometimes have a question about is like, how do you track and flow in deputy? This is way harder in the whip, I think, but I think the deputy is like the second hardest speech in terms of tracking because, like, yeah, if you give an extension speech, like, you don't have to track that closely, PMLO, eh. But deputy, it's like, okay, now you have like three or like two speeches to go through. How do you track this? How do you do this? I like to give like a little visual depiction of what this might look like. Um, so flowing. I think as a deputy, you want to be lean and judicious. There is an incentive, especially if you're coming from a more technical format, to really overwrite a lot, everything that someone says. I've seen people like do BP debate with like 13 pieces of paper when they're deputy, and like maybe that works for them. I've seen plenty of people who are very talented and it somehow, they can pull it off. Me personally, my like pea-sized tadpole brain cannot go up with 30 pieces of paper and understand what is going on. So I've tried to discipline myself to use like a singular piece of like A4 white paper, fold it in half, okay? Fold it in half again. And that's all I use for one round as a deputy. And then I go up with one singular piece of paper and I use that paper. Max two, okay? Max two. Sometimes I'll use two. What should you do when you flow? So, you want to make sure you capture the key premises and the impact of an argument, and you want to live edit and eliminate bad rebuttal in your head before writing it down. And then you want to further eliminate rebuttal as you prepare to give the deputy speech as you write it down. And lastly, you want to make sure you prioritize a good order of how you want to give your deputy. So, in practice, what does this look like? If you think of any argument as claim, necessary burdens, and an impact, you basically just want to write down the claim, whether they hit those necessary burdens and the impact. So, firstly, when you're flowing, you'll flow the PM, right? So, you'll flow the argument, premise, premise, impact, argument, premise, premise, impact. While you're flowing that, you probably want to write responses, right? So, you write one, two, three, these are my responses, and maybe you'll write four. Then, during your own partner speech, they'll give their arguments, right? So O will give their arguments, and then you might, next to those arguments, write down what it is that you want to rebuild, okay? The rebuttal that this argument receives, or the flaws that you have identified, and how you want to extend it. You might also, as you're thinking, realize which argument or which parts of the argument are the best parts. And you'll start forming that path to victory that we talked about in the introduction that we talked about. You want to frontline major pushes against those arguments. You want to think of how you want to frame it and how you want to weigh it. And I would write that next to the original argument itself. And somewhere near when you're going to speak, you want to think about the victory, the path to victory, and the introduction that you want to give. Then let's say the DPM comes up, right? You'll do something similar where you'll probably flow gov on the same side, and either this will be a new argument or it'll be part of the same argument, and you might want to flow your responses there as well. And finally, you might want to leave a gap at the bottom of this page to think about what new material or substantive content or extensions that you want to run. Then, before you get up, and as you're writing, you'll have a bunch of things on your paper. What I like to do is physically circle parts and then number them to give myself a clear idea of what I am going to say and when I'm going to say it. Some people say you should write this on a new piece of paper. If that works for you, that's perfectly fine. But I personally find that I just do not have enough time to actually be able to transfer all my content over in a deputy. And so it is way more helpful for me to say, one, I'm going to start with defending my side. Two, I will give these responses. And then four, I'll give new material, right? And so the other thing that I will just say is like if you are giving responses to an argument, it is good to have a tagline for those groups of responses so that you can force yourself to sort of give a like bottom line, right? A bottom line here. So for instance, if you're responding to arguments about, let's say, political solidarity, you might say, first, I'm going to explain why, our argument about blank is the most important and extend it. Second, I'm going to explain why political solidarity grows on our side and then give these responses. Third, I'm going to explain why people get personal agency. And fourthly, I'm going to extend on something else, right? So, like, I think having taglines also helps when you're signposting to be clear about what it is you are about to say as well. Right. Finally, then, there's this question as a deputy, which happens a decent amount where it's like you listen to the other team and like maybe they're either really good or really bad and you're just like confused what they're arguing. You're just genuinely like, I am boggled. I don't know what's going on right now. What do you do? In order of importance, one, I think you should review the tagline and keywords of their argument and just try to piece together what generally you think that they're making and make responses that respond to the best version of what the tagline and keywords imply. Especially if in prep, as I mentioned earlier, you're prepping out both sides. Like you're figuring out what the most common arguments are for both Gov and Op. You can generally assume that if you hear a keyword, it might be associated with one of those things that you have brainstormed, right? And assuming you've brainstormed them in a charitable way, you should be able to respond to them in a pretty sufficient manner. Second, ask or beg your partner for help, being like, did you catch what they said? Can you just give me a quick explanation or can I look at your flow? Thirdly, like let's say you're really confused about their arguments and the way that you've argued with them, then I think in the most charitable way, you should at least know the impacts that they're going for and try to just outweigh. Like if you cannot take down their case at a mechanism or a burden level, you can at least be like, they said this impact is true, assuming their very, very best case, which we don't think is true. How do we still win, right? And that's where your sort of 2 minutes to win it sort of come in. Fourthly, maybe least optimally is bluffing your way out. I don't think this is actually the most strategic. Um, but when in doubt, I've low-key gone up, blacked out, said some words, did not think I understood what the other side was saying, but you might find yourself actually having a better realization than maybe you originally anticipated, which I actually think happens maybe more often than not. Last piece of advice, which I didn't write here, but I think is somewhat helpful, is when you're prepping as a deputy, if your first speaker is taking some time to write the case and you just have a bit of free time, instead of twiddling your thumbs, I think what's really helpful is taking the list of arguments that you've brainstormed the other side to have and secret, like preemptively start thinking about and writing responses and positioning those responses. I am not the fastest thinker in the world, right? Like I am not like, some kind of genius that just whips out responses off the top of my head. I do think that like most people have a good idea of what a debate is going to be relatively about on the top half. And so at the point where I write down like 3 to 4 responses for the 2 to 3 main arguments that I think the other side is likely to give, I have a little bit of time to think about which of those responses are relatively better or worse. I'll have a piece of paper in front of me with those pre-written responses, and I'll just look towards it as I'm constructing my deputy speech and pick out the ones that I feel like are relevant and good. And so at least for me, a lot of the times coming up with responses live is not necessarily just originating unique and good ideas. It's picking and choosing ideas that me 15 minutes ago or 30 minutes ago has already come up with. Um, I think that's very helpful, especially if you're a beginner and you're like dude, I like can't do this. I can't fill my speech time. Like being your own ghostwriter, I think is a great way to make sure you at least have something to say. And like, let's say worst case, you are at a bit of a loss for words of how to respond to the case they gave. You could just give some of the preemptive responses you've already thought about and try to think of how you can turn that into offensive content. Offensive, not as in like offensive, but like offensive, um, for you to be able to add as unique contributions in the debate. Great. That is all I have for deputies. Kind of talked for a really long time with my hat. I guess I can take my deputy hat off because I'm officially retired. But for homework, first, watch a PMLO and practice giving a DPM, then watch the actual DPM and see how you differed. Not, I think, like in terms of the words you said or in terms of the like sort of content or specific responses, because that doesn't really matter. But in terms of like strategic prioritization, did you prioritize the same parts of the PM? Did you prioritize taking down the same parts of the LO, right? Like that's the kind of thing that I think is very helpful to practice in a drill. This video, very good. Highly recommend this lecture. And then I think Build a Case has really good articles about refutation and how to think about it strategically that shouldn't take too long to read, like max 15, 20 minutes. And good drills as well that I used to make this lecture and I think are just very helpful in general. So that's all I have for today. Hopefully this was somewhat helpful for people. And with that, I will sign off.